At the onset of the 1987 fire season, the heavily forested southwestern region of Oregon was in an extremely dry condition, the result of 3 years of low rainfall and light snowpack. Trees and ground vegetation were ready to ignite. They held little, if any, moisture. It was not an ordinary summer. Public service campaigns by the Oregon Department of Forestry and cooperative agencies warned of the extreme fire hazard posed by the drought conditions. The public was on notice. The first major fire of the season came on a hot afternoon in mid-July. At the base of Bland Mountain in Douglas County, a small grass fire ran up the hillside near the town of Days Creek. A faulty battery cable on a farm machine apparently started the blaze. Almost 10,000 acres were burned. 2 loggers lost their lives trying to move logging equipment. To bring the fire under control, state foresters brought in a fire overhead team using 875 firefighters and help from cooperating agencies. At the time, the fire was described as Oregon's worst in 2 decades. It was clear that major wildfires could still occur given the right combination of fuels, weather, and starts. On August 30th, an automated lightning detection system operated by the U.S. Bureau of Land Management recorded more than 1,600 lightning strikes over a 12-hour period. The dry lightning storm sweeping across northern California and southern Oregon touched off between 500 and 600 small fires. Within a day, flames were spreading on 3 national forests and lands protected by the Oregon Department of Forestry. The state agency protects private, state, and BLM timberlands. State crews launched the initial attack in Douglas, Jackson, and Josephine counties with help from rural fire departments and the forest industry.
The first series of storms came through late afternoon and started a number of fires. The storms were dry and also caused a lot of wind, so upon initial attack we had a lot of fire. We mobilized industry, rural fire district, and Bureau of Land Management crews and equipment, as well as aerial support, which included aerial tankers, helicopters, and aerial observation. We were able to keep a handle on these fires, but unfortunately at dark, another series of storms came through, started a number more fires. At that point, we attempted to order additional crews and helicopters, but found that none were immediately available because of the fire situation in California and elsewhere. By mid-morning the next day, it was obvious that our local resources and overhead couldn't keep up with the building fire situation, so we ordered our first overhead management team and intensified our efforts to round up the resources necessary.
In the first 2 days, the fires destroyed 5 homes and 5 other structures. A church counseling center near Weimar was lost. Over 500 homes were threatened.
I can't go up there?
No, we're not letting anyone in for personal possessions. You can turn around right here.
County Sheriff Departments helped evacuate 1,100 homes near Myrtle Creek, Weimar, Savage Creek, Sykes Creek, Canyonville, and other rural forested areas. Some 3,000 people had to seek other shelter. It became apparent early on that priorities must focus on life, property, and resources in that order.
There are a large number of homes in the rural forest area in our district, many of which are scattered and isolated. These homes pose considerable problems for the fire suppression efforts. We put our priorities on saving these homes and property, but in some cases, homes were lost. In this particular instance, a crown fire came down the canyon and took out this home. This home had virtually no clearing or a fuel break, if you will, around it. Had the home had a fuel break, it might still be standing today.
Major fires were still burning out of control after 3 days. 14 of them were 3,000 acres or larger in size. At this stage, the management of firefighting resources needed clear direction. State and federal agencies set up a unified coordinating group at the Oregon Department of Forestry in Salem.
Basically, we had three levels of coordination among all the agencies that were involved. The statewide group in Salem consisted of representatives of the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs, National Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife. The state agencies represented there were the State Fire Marshal, the National Guard, and ourselves. The Southern Oregon group at Roseburg consisted of representatives of some of those agencies, and the local coordination groups, the third level, which met either at the fire camps or at the local district offices, included representatives from the specific agencies who were involved at that point. The function of these groups is, number one, to provide a forum for direct communication among all the agencies who are involved, as well as the general public, and secondly, to develop priorities for the allocation of firefighting resources.
Getting enough firefighters into Southern Oregon was a top management priority. The Department of Forestry was fighting fire on both private and BLM lands. Thousands of acres were being consumed on the Umpqua, Siskiyou, and Rogue River National Forests in Oregon. In Northern California, 250,000 acres of timberland was on fire. The Oregon Fire Management Group had to compete with California for firefighters.
And as these fires developed into project fires, we contacted the National Interagency Fire Center at Boise. They indicated to us they had 78 crews on order and that the barrel was empty. As crews became available, they would make those available to California and Oregon on a 50% basis to each state. At that time, we decided that we would sort of in-run the system. We went to the Canadians, and they offered us 3 air tankers, which we obtained, and 54 very experienced overhead. And we brought those into the Southern Oregon fires. We also asked the governor to activate the National Guard. We went to the forest industry and asked them to start putting crews together to send to Southern Oregon. And we went to our friends up in Washington and Montana and Idaho for equipment and manpower also.
Still growing in size and now threatening more private property, the drama of the fires became very real. County emergency services and the Red Cross provided temporary shelter for evacuees. Even large cities not threatened directly by the fires were impacted. A temperature inversion filled the valleys with smoke. Unhealthful air quality alerts were broadcast. People were cautioned not to exercise outdoors and to stay inside their homes.
I want to make the point that at this point, according to the state forester, the state's bill is running at about $1.5 million a day.
In declaring a state of emergency, Governor Neil Goldschmidt called up Oregon National Guard units and made all state resources available. More than 1,200 troops were transported to the major fire camps at Tri-City, Galice, and Valley of the Rogue State Park. The National Guard moved hundreds of firefighters each day to the fire lines and provided logistical help in the fire camps. Other special and unique resources were brought into play. Some 650 U.S. Army troops from Fort Ord, California were assigned to the Longwood Fire Complex at Cave Junction by the Forest Service. The Oregon Fire Marshal recommended the governor invoke emergency powers to order up support from local and rural fire departments. 44 fire engines were brought in from throughout the state and assigned to protect homes. All of these actions freed up state resources to attack the main fires. Help came from everywhere. Equipment and trained crews from Oregon's private timber companies were being used. Firefighting teams from 10 states were called up by the Federal Interagency Fire Center at Boise, Idaho. The influx of thousands of people called for a lot of support at the major state fire camps. 2,200 people were assigned to the Tri-City camp. More than 1,500 firefighters were staged at the Galice camp. At Valley of the Rogue State Park, more than 2,000 firefighters and overhead personnel were calling this home. The cost of these operations was high.
Our food bill is running about $30,000 a day. I don't have a fuel cost, but the overall effort's somewhere in the neighborhood of about $400,000 a day for this specific operation.
At the camps, firefighting tools need to be sharpened and repaired. It's a task that never ends. Firefighters work around the clock. There are crews out on the lines all day, other shifts at work all night. The logistics team has to keep the flow of supplies coming in. Things like food, clothing, tools, fuel, vehicles, and even the mail. Communication lines are tied up 24 hours a day. There's something different from the ordinary in these camps.
Well, if I had to describe a normal fire for an overhead fire team, it would be a single fire, maybe 3,000 acres in size, with maybe 400 firefighters, and would last for a term of maybe 3 to 6 days. Of course, there was nothing normal about the Southern Oregon fire situation. The particular complex that my team was given had 3 fires for a total of over 15,000 acres. We had over 2,000 firefighters, and the duration was for 16 days.
Supplies for some crews on the Galice fire had to be sent in by water. These rafts brought drinking water and tools to crews working on a fire line near the wild and scenic Rogue River corridor. Crews in these remote areas were on coyote shifts. They would either sleep out on their fire line or stay in spike camps. The conditions the firefighters had to work under were extreme. The terrain, steep. The weather, hot. The fire, stubborn. There was little question this fire would have to be fought on the ground. Aerial retardant planes were standing by at Redmond, Medford, and Klamath Falls. But none could be used in the fire area. While the high humidity and lack of wind helped to slow down the blazes, the thick smoke made aerial attack difficult. Yet on the perimeters of many of the fires, water drops by helicopter were effective. But it was clear that only a change in the weather would finally put these fires out. Three weeks after they started burning, all but 2 of the fires that would char upwards of 150,000 acres in southern Oregon were contained. The Silver Fire on the nearby Siskiyou National Forest remained out of control for more than a month as it burned inexorably toward 100,000 acres. The Department of Forestry fire on BLM lands near Galice was contained at over 21,000 acres. A close look at the Galice fire camp pointed out a unique aspect of interagency cooperation. At one point, there was not one incident commander in charge, but 2. The State Forestry IC and his staff worked for a short time with the Forest Service overhead team until a state team was available from fires already controlled. With prevailing dry weather, mopping up the hot spots around the lines was critical to keep any of the lines from coming to life again. The cost was already high, over $150 million in losses to commercial timber and wildlife. $2.5 million were spent each day during the first 14 days to meet the cost of firefighting, resources, people, and supplies. While the State Emergency Fund and other sources help offset these unbudgeted costs during a crisis like this, there are other expenses facing Oregon now that the fires are out.
Following the control of the fires in southern Oregon, the major task faced by the landowners is the salvage of the timber, protection of the watershed, and reforestation. The forest industry, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Forest Service have plans well underway to accomplish these tasks. The department's focusing its effort on the 6,400 acres of non-industrial private forest lands that were burned by the fire. About a quarter of this needs salvage and reforestation. These landowners generally do not have professional foresters on their staff to help them accomplish these tasks. Therefore, Department Service foresters are working with these landowners to identify what needs to be done. Getting all these lands back into production is important in order to ensure a future timber supply for Oregon, as well as the southern Oregon area, which is highly dependent on timber supply.
Conditions for the September fire crisis were in place. Drought, hot weather, lots of dry ground fuels, and a powerful lightning storm. But the fires were brought under control. It required a total drain of resources and interagency cooperation from top to bottom. There were few major injuries, no lives were lost. But the crisis does raise questions about priorities. Human life is to be protected at all cost. But what is the right balance between valuable forest resources and human property? During this disaster, private landowners in rural areas would do anything to protect their homes. People who choose to live in rural forested areas do have an impact on fire control tactics and budgeting.
The department spent nearly $30 million suppressing the Southern Oregon fires and other fires in Western Oregon. These costs greatly exceeded the funds available to the department. As a result, the department made a report to the Oregon legislature on the potential impact to forest landowners and to the people of Oregon. The legislature asked the department to explore options for paying for these fires. The options could range from the forest landowner paying for all the costs to an appropriation from the general fund. This past summer's firefighting experience went very well, owing to the outstanding cooperation of the agencies and organizations involved. However, what if we have to face another 1987 fire season? That raises a couple interesting policy questions. The first is, who should pay for fire control in a rural forest interface? This is particularly important when homes are saved at the expense of the forest resource. The second question is, does Oregon have the right firefighting strategy when homes and forests are commingled? Both of these are tough questions that the agencies and organizations must consider as we look at the potential for another wildfire disaster.